Hello, I'm Dr. Craig Childress. I'm a clinical psychologist in Pasadena, California. I work with children and families around issues of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, parent-child relationship problems, angry, oppositional, defiant children, marital problems. And in this particular video series, I've been discussing a type of parent-child relationship problem that I refer to as a parental alienation dynamic. And in this video sequence, I'm going to be discussing the specific DSM-4 diagnoses related to the child's enmeshed psychological relationship with the alienating parent. Now, in the previous discussion of the child's DSM-4 diagnoses, I spoke about how the child's symptoms are an expression of the underlying psychopathology of the personality disorder of the alienating parent. So it's the psychopathology of the alienating parent that is actually the driving force in this process. And then I discussed how the child's active hostile aggression towards the targeted parent represents a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder, even though the child is not presenting that kind of oppositional defiant behavior in other settings, and how the child's good behavior in other settings is also a manifestation of the personality disorder dynamics of the alienating parent. And so the child is enacting an alienation dynamic whereby the good behavior with the alienating parent serves to define the alienating parent as superlative and so support the narcissistic inflation. In addition, the good behavior in other settings isolates the child's angry towards the targeted parent, and so thereby defines that it's the targeted parent who's the problem rather than the child, since the child's behavior is so good in other settings. And so while the child is only presenting this angry hostile in one setting, in my view, it still merits a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder, and that once you separate the child from the controlling influence of the alienating parent, you will begin to see the child's pathology in all its glory, and the child will become oppositional defiant, nasty, hostile, negative, and even some conduct disorder features like running away from home, property destruction, violence, and aggression. Now, in this particular segment, I want to talk about the child's DSM-4 diagnosis related to the enmeshed psychological relationship. And let me return to that behavioral sequence where we ask the parent and the child and them both together. So what happened in this conflict? What did you do? What did the child do in response? And then how did you respond to that? And then what did the child do? And what did the parent do? So you collect this behavior sequence or a sequence of relational moves relative to a specific conflict situation. You do that for 3 or 4 different conflicts. And then when you look at that, what you will notice is the child provokes the situation. The child is not the victim of abuse. The child is the perpetrator of abuse. And that's the origins of the oppositional defiant disorder. But then when you ask the child about that situation, what you will find is the child justifies their anger by the parental response. So the child provokes the parental response and then uses the parental response as justification for why they provoked in the first place. So a typical situation you might have is a parent says, pick up your shoes, take them to the room. Child says, don't tell me what to do, you blankety blank. Parent says, don't talk to me like that, that's not an appropriate attitude. The child says, I'll talk to you however I like, you blankety blank, 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 blank. Parent says, if you continue to talk to me like that, I'm going to pull your TV for tonight. Child says, how dare you pull my TV? Dad never takes my TV. You're just a mean blankety blank, 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 blank. I hate you, blankety blank, blank, blank. Okay. When you ask the child, why were you so angry at your parent? What they will tell you is, because they took my TV away. They will use the parental response to justify their anger. And when you take that same behavioral sequence to the alienating parent, they will do exactly the same thing. You say, look how your child is provoking the situation. Look how mean, defiant, rude, and oppositional your child is being. And the alienating parent will say, well, it's because they took the TV away. The child, that's totally justified. They will minimize and justify the child's behavior based on the targeted parent's response. When you point out that the targeted parent, the taking the TV away, occurred later in the sequence and it was in response to the child's provocation, the alienating parent will typically just look at you with kind of a blank stare. They will go into this denial process. They are incapable of incorporating that information into their meaning structure regarding the situation. And that has to do with their personality disorder, that they are fixed in this belief that it is the targeted parent who deserves this treatment, and is the target parent who is abusive. And if you offer them contrary evidence that it is in fact the child who is being abusive, they are simply unable to integrate or incorporate that information. And that serves as sort of the evidence for the fixed false belief system that is non-responsive to contrary evidence. Now, in returning to the child related to this belief system that uses the parental response as justification for the angry, when you challenge that and say, wait a minute, your parent took your TV away because you were angry and hostile. So what was causing that angry and hostile to begin with? The child will similarly kind of go into this vague state and then kind of look at you. And typically what they will say is, I don't know, I just hate them. They just irritate me, just for being. And that's oftentimes where I kind of offer up to the child, it sounds like it's not so much what your parent does, it's more about who they are. And the child goes, yes, that's absolutely it. I just hate them for who they are. And what that represents, that's not an authentic experience to the child. What that represents is the fused psychological state with the alienating parent is downloading to the child the narcissistic rage of the alienating parent. In addition, there's that borderline process of abandonment whereby the child is abandoning the targeted parent. And so the child is motivated to abandon and to separate from the targeted parent, and that's being driven by this powerfully borderline personality disorder process. And so the child doesn't quite understand why they hate that parent, they just know they do. And that represents this fused psychological state between the child and the alienating parent, whereby the child is absorbing the psychopathology of the alienating parent. Now, from a DSM-4 diagnostic perspective, what that represents is a shared psychotic disorder. Now, the DSM defines a shared psychotic disorder as when a delusion is shared between two people who are psychologically or emotionally close, and one of the people has a delusion and the other person sort of adopts the delusion of that close associate. And in this case, the delusional disorder is with the alienating parent that's being driven or created by the personality disorder. And the child, because the child's in a fused psychological state, sort of absorbs that delusional disorder, that the parent is abusive, that the parent is inadequate, and therefore merits punishment and merits this retaliation. And so the child absorbs that from the psychological structure of the alienating parent and the meaning structure of the alienating parent, and then expresses that towards the targeted parent. And so the diagnosis for that enmeshed relationship is a shared psychotic disorder. And so the full diagnosis involved with the alienation dynamic is a personality disorder, narcissistically organized with borderline and paranoid features, and a persecutory delusional disorder, encapsulated non-bizarre. And that's the diagnosis for the alienating parent. The primary diagnosis in this regard I would tend to give to the personality disorder, which then gives rise to the persecutory delusional disorder. And for the child, the diagnosis is a shared psychotic disorder and an oppositional defiant disorder. And in this case, I would give primacy to definitely the shared psychotic disorder that is then giving rise to the oppositional defiant disorder. So that is the specific diagnostic constellation associated with the alienation dynamic. And going forward, I will begin to discuss some of the treatment-related issues to working with this type of process.